Video number 3 in my series about the complete rules of Interstellar, the game by Phil Eklund and Justin Gray. In the previous video, we saw how to maneuver the Exodus spaceship, how to explore the surrounding space, and how to manage energy through the use of batteries. But in my example, as I'm sure you've noticed, I've glossed over a lot of things that are printed on the map, but which cannot be overlooked at all. Now it's high time we took a closer look at these interstellar hazards, and in particular at the biggest of them all, particle cloud LIC. So, let's suppose the Exodus is here. The next dot it has to enter is an LIC, a cloud of interstellar particles. And what happens in the navigation phase when it enters the cloud? Easy but potentially devastating. The LIC eliminates the first blueprint, the first section at the front of the ship. In the normal configuration, the first blueprint is the wardens, that is, basically the exit airlock and all the equipment required for external operations. This blueprint is destroyed by the LIC. And this is a big problem because all the maintenance actions that were on this blueprint will no longer be available until the end of the game, and there's no way of repairing such a loss. But there is one small consolation. And now it's time to talk about nuggets again. These are 4 small wooden tokens, 2 with a circle, 2 with a cross. At the beginning of the game, they are shuffled face down and 1 is removed at random. The remaining 3 are placed here in the cosmos. And what hides on these 3 tokens is nothing less than the nature of reality. The trick, if you're at all familiar with wave-corpuscle duality and the Schrödinger equation, is to find out whether nature, particles and matter has an objective reality even if no one is observing it. That's objective nature, and in the game that's when there's a majority of crosses among the 3 nuggets, or whether the physical reality of the universe depends on our consciousness, the subjectivity hypothesis, if there's a majority of circles. To give you an example, take this experiment, whose aim is to demonstrate the existence of the noosphere, which would be a kind of autonomous consciousness on the scale of the entire universe. Of course, if it turns out that the true nature of the universe is subjective, so outside of consciousness, this experiment is worthless, and that's why it's worth 0 victory points if there's a majority of nuggets with a cross. Well, back to the game. When the Exodus enters a particle cloud, an LIC dot, it loses its foremost blueprint. But a nugget from the cosmos is placed in front of the ship. What has actually happened is that this violent interaction with relativistic particles has yielded some information about the nature of reality. But for the moment, this precious information, this nugget, is floating at the front of the ship, so nobody knows whether it's a circle or a cross. To find out, we'll have to go and look for it. But it's progress nonetheless, because remember this simple rule, a nugget in the cosmos is totally inaccessible, whereas a nugget at the front of the ship is just waiting for only one thing, and that's for you to come and get it. Well, that's all well and good, but if every time we enter an LIC we lose the front section of the ship, we are going to get sliced and diced, and we are not likely to cross the galaxy in our rocket. So, you guessed it, there is a solution, and the solution is to build a shield at the front of the ship. And this shield thing is so important that right from the beginning of the game, as soon as the Exodus takes off, each player, and therefore each ideology, stores enough material in the space allocated to them to make a shield. Shield tiles in each player colors are placed face down on one of each player's matte boxes. And so you see, for example, that yellow and green players, who both have an awakened cyborg on board, now have just one of the 3 slots available, but since even the smallest particle cloud on the map can cut a slice from the ship, it's worth sacrificing a little space for shields. Fine, but how do you make a shield? The first problem is one of mass. The mass of the shield we are going to add to the rocket has to come from somewhere. You cannot create matter in mid-flight. It's all recycling. So, to add a shield to the front of the ship, you have to reduce another part of the ship. In this game, the rocket's mass is represented by its length, and the full starting length is 400 tons, written here in very small type. And then, during the journey, the crew can flip over a blueprint and reform the same ship but a little shorter, so a little lighter. And since we freed up length and therefore mass, a player can now bring his shield and add it face up to the front of the ship. So first, this operation freed up one slot on the player's mat, and he'll be able to use this space to carry out a host of scientific experiments, as we will see shortly, but also, the next time the ship enters a particle cloud, an LIC dot, the first section to be destroyed will be this shield. The destroy shield is returned face down to the player's mat, and this means that he can rebuild this shield later, and a nugget is placed face down at the front of the ship. And that's it. The result is the same as before, except that we haven't destroyed any useful sections of the ship. And we haven't lost the maintenance actions on the Warden's blueprint. And that's great, because look at this. The maintenance action associated with blueprint Wardens is prospecting, and it consists precisely in recovering the nugget, the interstellar particles resulting from the destruction of the shield. A player assigns his cyborg or avatar to this action, consumes 2 battery points, and recovers the nugget to his personal mat. This is important for him and for the whole crew, because recovering nuggets earns victory points. Put another way, discovering the nature of reality is one of mankind's objectives. And owning a nugget is also a prerequisite for making some planets habitable. Colonizing this planet, for example, requires the crew to own at least 1 nugget. And finally, yellow player in our example can peek at his nugget, and it gives him just a little bit of information about that famous nature of reality, objective or subjective. He can tell his fellow travelers or keep it to himself. It's up to him. But either way, the nugget remains face down on his mat, and that's important. Building a shield so that it can be destroyed by a particle cloud is the normal way of using a shield. And this is even rewarded with the medallion. The first player to have his shield destroyed in this way received the Guardian medallion. It's a medallion that goes to the first player to have his shield destroyed, so no one can take it from him afterwards. On the other hand, there's a second medallion, the Watchdog medallion, which goes to the last player to have his shield destroyed, and this one can be passed from player to player until the end of the game. Note that a player who has the Guardian medallion cannot also have the Watchdog medallion. You can never have 2 medallions of the same shape. So, collecting these nuggets is very important, and the main way to do this is to fly through a particle cloud, an LIC, if possible with a shield at the front of the ship. So, in this diagram, the only thing we don't know yet is how to build a shield. In fact, we've already seen part of it. To make a shield, you have to make room by reducing the size of an existing blueprint. This is a maintenance action called foamed metal, which is present on every blueprint. So you can slenderize any blueprint by assigning a cyborg or an avatar to it, as we've already seen. But beware of the prerequisite. To perform this foamed metal action, the crew must have 3 identical augmentations. What are augmentations? Well, it's basically scientific knowledge, but to fully understand all this, we must first have a look at the medium of scientific knowledge, Workcells. Here's an example of a Workcell. You can see it as a laboratory, and this one deploys a kind of sail to capture plasma, that is free particles from space, and uses it to slow down the ship through the friction of these particles. In game terms, this scientific experiment reduces the exodus speed by 1 without igniting the engines. And this is very interesting because anything that saves our precious fuel is a good thing. Okay, but where do these wonderful scientific projects come from? Next to the map board, there's a marketplace of scientific ideas that look like this. It represents the ideas that are in the air inside the station, so if someone starts thinking, one of these ideas will come to his mind. In game terms, all this happens during the allocation phase. And it all depends on whether the character you are assigning is a cyborg, a big die, or an avatar, a small die. If he's a cyborg, let's say grey player, he's a human being and so he's creative and can start a new scientific program from scratch. This is called a research action. He chooses the card he wants from the marketplace and moves it to a player's board. He installs the experiment in the spaceship, and this experiment takes up some space. Note that in each large box on the player's mats, there is room for 2 Workcells, 2 experiments. So Grey Player, for example, may have 1 box for his cyborg, 1 for his shield, and 2 Workcells in the third remaining box. Note that on the market side, the card location remains empty. And note that each market ID is linked to a stress level corresponding to the line the card occupies in the table. Here, Grey Player took a card from line 1 and therefore he receives 1 stress token. Creativity is notorious for tormenting your mind. However, an avatar cannot do this. Red Player has no awakened cyborg. His avatar, which is just a robot, cannot retrieve a Workcell card from the market. But still, he can make himself useful by cleaning up the market space. The game calls this the librarian action. The avatar is put on an ID, and that ID is discarded. And the point here is that this card will be replaced at the end of the turn, and so the avatar helps to increase the chances of a more interesting card arriving later on the market. Note that this activity is stress-free, regardless of where the ID is in the market. An avatar is a robot and a robot doesn't stress. Then the same goes for White Player. He cannot get any IDs, but what he can do is simply go and work in a laboratory, a Workcell, which is already installed on a player's mat. So he can go to Grey Player's Workcell, for example. And we go on. Yellow Player can also go and help on the Workcell, and Purple Player can clean up the market. And then Green Player. He has a cyborg, a human. He also could go on Grey Player's Workcell card on his mat to help him. He cannot go and clean the market like an avatar because he's not an avatar and only avatars can do the librarian action. But on the other hand, he can do research. He picks up a card from the market. He receives no stress because the card comes from line 0. And look, he can set up his experiment anywhere on the ship. Here, for example, he could place it on Red Player's mat. He can even put it on Grey Player's mat because, as you know, each large box can hold 2 Workcell cards. And note that Red Player, for example, cannot work on this Workcell simply because, on Red Player's turn, this Workcell did not yet exist. The player's order is very important. As Red Player always plays before Green Player, he cannot immediately set up on a Workcell created by Green Player. He has to wait until next turn. And that's it. Next comes the Workcell phase, when all the staff assigned to the labs, cyborgs and avatars, actually go to work. The resolution order is decided by the commander, which is what the sheriff star means. And Green Player, who is the commander, may decide to resolve his own experiment first. So, to resolve an experiment, a Workcell, all you have to do is to roll the dice on the board. Then you look at the result on this chart on the game board. This table has two lines, and we start by looking at the chance of success. On line 1, you need to roll a 1. Line 2 requires a 1 or a 2. All other results are failures. And if the die result is 6, things go wrong and the cyborg gets a stress token. Fine, but why are there two lines? And why would we choose the first one? Well, right at the beginning of the game, before the Exodus takes off, the first female commander, who is drawn randomly, must make a choice. She can either start with a full tank of fuel, but then, look at the symbol, it's the same one here. It means that for the entire journey, Workcells rolls will be made on the first line. Or she can choose to start with less fuel, but Workcell rolls will be made on the second line. It's a real strategic choice that will weigh on the entire mission. Do we use the available load to transport fuel or scientific equipment? Let's suppose she chose line 2. We show that with a large blue pawn. Green player rolls a die. 5, it's a miss, but she doesn't suffer any stress. Stress occurs on a result of 6. And for some dangerous experiments, which we recognize by this symbol, a 6 means the death of the cyborg. Note that if it's an avatar, a small die, it dies too, but it doesn't matter because it's a robot and we can always repair it before the next turn. For simplicity's sake, remember that an avatar never dies. Here with a 5, nothing serious happens. Green player just lost her turn, which, don't forget, in space represents 12 years. Note that the card, the Workcells, stays where it is. And so, on the next turn, green player or other players can put their avatar or cyborg there to try their luck again. Then it's the turn of the other Workcell, on grey player's mat. In any case, all Workcells to which manpower has been assigned must be resolved. It's too late to change your mind. The 3 dice are rolled. Both yellow and white avatars succeeded, but the cyborg failed. The experiment as a whole has succeeded. Only one participant needs to pass his roll. And when an experiment succeeds, you simply carry out what's written on the card. And don't forget, it's mandatory. The crew deployed the sail. It worked, so the ship slows down. And the fact that 2 characters succeeded doesn't make it happen twice. And if there's a choice, who decides? For example, this other card is used to collect a nugget. If 2 characters succeed, which nugget is retrieved and which player takes it? Well, in this case, it's the player who succeeds on the die roll who decides. And if there's more than one, it's the owner of the mat where the experiment takes place who breaks the tie. In our example, the experiment took place on grey player's mat, so grey player decides between yellow and white who gets the experiment's bonuses. The chosen player is called the chief engineer. Remember this term. It's important and it will be used a lot in these rules. The chief engineer is the player who takes all the credit for the success of an experiment. But it's not over, because taking part in scientific experiments obviously increases theoretical knowledge. And so, any cyborg and therefore any human, big dice only, who takes part in a successful experiment earns an augmentation. An augmentation is a small wooden token, always blue, which matches the card symbol. In this case, it's the jar symbol. And so grey player gets this augmentation. He takes it on his mat. And note that grey player gets the augmentation even if he failed his roll. The fact that the experiment succeeds, regardless of who passed his roll, grants an augmentation to all cyborgs in the laboratory, so on the Workcell card. Yellow and white player receive nothing because an avatar doesn't get augmentations. And last but not least, the chief engineer can decide to take the workcell home with him on his own mat. In our case, because two players have passed their role, white and yellow can become chief engineer. Note that an avatar can be a chief engineer. And since the experiment took place on grey player's mat, it's up to him to decide who is the chief engineer and therefore who gets to take the experiment on his mat. Of course, it's at moments like this that negotiations begin. Let's assume that grey player appoints white player as chief engineer. White player then takes the workcell card. Note that he doesn't have to do so, and he can also leave it there. And so, what's the point of taking the workcell home? Well, first and next time, it's white player who will decide between ties. And then, at the end of the game, workcells give victory points to their owner, and who gets them can matter if the game has become competitive in the meantime. And that's it, that's how science experiments work. And while we are at it, let's get to the end of the round. At the very end of each round, there's a technical reset phase. All avatars and cyborgs go back to the political diagram, the large colored hexagon, and the holes in the marketplace are filled by sliding the cards from top to bottom. And the game is ready for the next round. The important thing to remember here is the difference between research and the day-to-day work of a laboratory scientist. Research in this game means picking up a card from the marketplace and putting it on a player's mat, usually on your own mat, but it can also be on a friend's one, especially when you start having room problems. And only cyborgs can do research. Laboratory work means assigning manpower, and in this case it can be an avatar, to an experiment, a workcell card, already installed in the ship, so on a player's mat. And it's important to understand this two-step logic. You always need a human, a cyborg, a big die to set up the experiment on a mat. But after that, it can run with avatars only. And what's also important to understand is that research, the action of moving workcell cards from the market to the ship, doesn't require any roll of the dice. It just costs a little stress. Lab work, on the other hand, requires a die roll, and you can never be sure if it's going to work. And so, once you filled the ship with a lot of experiments, you get some kind of superpowers menu, free exploration, stress cure, and so on. But each time you want to use and benefit from these powers, you have to reassign workers to them and roll the die again. When it comes to research, you do it once and it's done. Lab work, on the other hand, has to be repeated every time it's needed. Fine, but we don't do science just to get gadgets and superpowers. We also do it to improve our theoretical knowledge, or in other words, to earn augmentations. Some blue tokens matching the logo at the top of the card. Note that only cyborgs, so humans, can earn this augmentation by working on workcells. And the augmentation goes to the player's mat, where it remains until the end of the game. The augmentation is not linked to a specific cyborg. If the cyborg dies, the player keeps the augmentation. And after a full circle, we go back to where we come from. After this long detour through research and workcells, we can get back to our original topic, slenderizing the ship's sections and the necessary use of shields. You remember this? On each section of the ship, on each blueprint, there's a maintenance action called foamed metal, which slenderizes the section, thus saving space and enabling the installation of a shield at the front of the ship. And all foamed metal actions on all blueprints have the same prerequisite: the crew must have 3 copies of the same augmentation. This means that to optimize and slenderize a section of the ship, the crew must accumulate enough theoretical knowledge about the scientific field linked to that section of the ship. To slenderize the life support section, you need 3 heart-shaped augmentations. This doesn't mean you must have 3 cards with the heart symbol. As in this example, you only need 1 life support workcell with a heart, but you do need 3 cyborgs who have worked on it. And by the way, as you remember, only one of them needs to pass his roll, and then all those assigned to the workcell get their augmentation. And you also remember, an avatar can help pass the die roll, but won't earn an augmentation himself. So, it looks easy, just a roll of the dice with a very good chance of success, but the hidden difficulty is that you need 3 cyborgs. And there are only 2 on board at takeoff, so you'll have to wake one up. 3 cyborgs out of a possible 12, that's already a quarter of the crew you used. And as we will see later, the crew is your most precious resource. But hey, let's assume you do that. And once the crew has collected all 3 augmentations, simply assign anyone to the maintenance action. And when the time comes, the blueprint is flipped and turned to its upright position. Note that the worker assigned to the operation doesn't need to have the augmentation himself. The augmentation just needs to exist in 3 copies on other players' mats. And then, in the space freed up at the front of the ship, the player who took the action, in this case red player, has the option, it's not mandatory, of putting a shield there. In general, he puts up his own shield, but it's not mandatory either. He can also use another player's shield. This frees up space for new workcells on red player's mat, but above all, it adds that shield which will be consumed when the ship passes through the next particle cloud, the LIC. So you've got the pattern you will be following from the moment the Exodus takes off. In a nutshell, you start by doing research and equipping the ship with various workcells, then you work on them and learn things, you earn augmentations, and then when you've got a good knowledge of the field, that means 3 identical augmentations, you optimize, you slenderize the matching section and build a shield at the front of the ship. At this point, the commander drives the ship straight through a cloud of particles, an LIC. Erosion destroys the shield, but in the process, it recovers the precious nugget that will tell you about the true nature of reality. That's the main scheme. And now, there are a few technical details to look into. Let's go. First of all, when a player has an augmentation token, that means he has a good knowledge of that field. Purple player here is really good at engines. That's what means the triangle symbol. So, if he has to work on an experiment in this field, engines, he's more likely to succeed. For example, if purple player decides to work on the beryllium radiator's workcell, which by the way allows you to pass through a particle cloud without eroding the shield and still get the nugget, very useful, well, purple player, because he's got the right augmentation, will succeed with a die roll of 1 or 2 on the first line of the table and 1, 2, 3 or 4 on the second line. Remember that the line you look at depends on the choice made by the commander at the very beginning of the game. That's what the text "success if augmented" on the board means. And it doesn't matter whether the die is a cyborg or an avatar. The augmentation itself can only be gained by a cyborg, but once the player has it on his mat, he gets the benefit from it no matter which character he uses, avatar or cyborg. Then, let's suppose in this example that purple player wants to do research moving a card from the marketplace. For this, as we know, he needs a human, a cyborg, and he chooses the card that he wants. But this card has a prerequisite, a triangle showing that in order to research this card, you must already possess the triangle augmentation. So here it is, purple player can retrieve this card. Note that when you pick up a card like this, you don't have to put it on your own mat. Purple player can, for example, put the Workcell on yellow player's mat, even if yellow player doesn't have the triangle augmentation. What matters is the cyborg doing the research, in this case, purple. And even then, another player can assign an avatar to help working on the Workcell without having a triangle augmentation. The prerequisite specifies to research, which means that it only applies to the character performing the research action. The symbol at the top of the cards also indicates where on the ship the matching laboratories are located. So, for example, here, let's assume we've completed the Workcell and maintenance phases. Now we move on to navigation, and on the game map, the Exodus enters a particle cloud LIC. The effect is to destroy the first section of the ship. Without a shield, the Warden section is destroyed. Okay, so obviously the red avatar who's in the middle of maintenance in this section of the ship is eliminated. But it doesn't matter because when an avatar dies, it is automatically replaced. Avatars are utility robots and you can build as many as you like. But also, any Workcells that have the same symbol as the destroyed blueprint are also eliminated. Here the symbol is a hexagon. So this card is destroyed. And not just the card, but everyone who worked in this laboratory, the yellow avatar and the purple cyborg. And it's also for this reason that you should keep the habit of leaving dice where they are even after resolving their actions, Workcell and maintenance. Because if something happens to the blueprint they are in, you need to be able to remember that they should suffer the consequences. We will soon see that this also applies to attacks by the goo. And note that when a blueprint is destroyed, all experiments and ideas linked to this blueprint become by nature impossible to carry out. In practical terms, this means that all cards bearing the same symbol as the destroyed blueprint are removed from the market. Now let's take a breath and change the topic by noticing that some Workcell cards have the icon of a small planet Earth. This means that these experiments are of particular importance to the governments of Earth. These gentlemen from the government are interested in what you can find on the topic, and they are willing to give a lot in return. So, at the beginning of the game, each player has a small wooden dome of his or her own color. And as soon as a player retrieves a card with the Earth symbol, with a research action, he immediately places a colored dome on the Earth symbol. Here he puts his own dome on the card and retrieves it to his own mat. This is the most common case, but remember that a player can always place the card he has just researched on someone else's board. And he can also put another player's dome on it. Anyway, let's suppose that here he throws a 6. Bad luck, because with this logo, any cyborg who rolls a 6 dies in the experiment. Pachamama the ecologist doesn't survive. All this to say that a lot of things can happen in this game, but the dome set at the start stays there on the card, until someone succeeds in the experiment. Here it's a white avatar, and then, no choice, he takes the dome from the card and puts it on the game map, where the Exodus is. The Exodus has succeeded in the experiment that so interests the Earth. And the radio signal of this victory, represented by the dome, has just been sent into space. In the navigation phase, the Exodus will move forward as usual, and the radio signal, the dome, will advance towards Earth 12 dots. Always 12 dots, that's the speed of a radio signal. The signal takes the shortest route, and it passes through any obstacle. And the same goes for the navigation phases on next rounds, until the radio signal reaches the solar system. And then, the player who owns the dome, in this case a green player, immediately receives the pale blue dot medallion. Like all medallions, It will earn victory points at the end of the mission, and note that since this medallion goes to the last signal sent to Earth, if another signal from another player reaches Earth later, that other player will get the medallion. If the game is cooperative, this makes no difference, but you never know how things are going to turn out. At the beginning of the game, each player draws a secret Earth data card. This is some kind of government secret science that the Earth is ready to give to the player in exchange for the results of his experiments. The player can look at this card at the beginning of the game, but he cannot do anything with it. And as soon as his signal, his little dome, reaches the Earth, he flips his Earth data card and it becomes effective. For example, with this one, Earth sends a technology that polarizes deuterium. And the effect is that igniting the engines will no longer inflict stress on the crew, and the Workcell experiments can no longer kill the cyborgs on a result of 6. The 6 Earth data cards all offer powers of this kind, quite powerful, so communication with Earth is a strategy that usually pays off. And player has only one dome of his own color, so these whole procedures of communicating with Earth is only possible once for each player, so 6 times in total for the whole mission. And finally, we are going to end this video with a very special type of experiment. We've already talked a little about them, Foolhardy experiments. You can recognize them by this logo top left. And what does this logo say? It says that in order to research this card, that means to go and find it in the marketplace with a cyborg, but also to resolve this card, that means to roll the die in the Workcell phase, well, in both cases, at both times, there must be at least one available unresolved nugget somewhere. Available means outside the Cosmos box, unresolved means face down. And now it's time to recap to make sure we all agree with the basics. Remember this diagram we've seen before, which explains that nuggets start in the depth of Cosmos and that to get them out, all you have to do is to fly through some particle clouds, the LIC dots. This destroys the front part of the ship but allows you to collect some of these precious particles with the prospecting maintenance action. And here we are. We know that nuggets are basically face down and in 3 possible places: in the Cosmos, at the front of the ship, or in a player's possession on his mat. And I insist, in all 3 cases, the nugget is face down. If it's on a player's mat, the player can peek to see if it's a cross or a circle, but he must leave it face down. Because the only way to flip a nugget face up is with a Foolhardy experiment. And that's what you have to keep in mind. Besides that, the Foolhardy Workcell works exactly like any other Workcell. As long as the nugget prerequisite is met, a cyborg can research for the card and move it from the market to a player's mat. Then, if the dice roll is successful, you do what's written on the card, but in the case of a Foolhardy experiment, this text always depends on the nature of reality, objective the cross or subjective the circle. With this card, for example, if it turns out that reality is objective, we move the blue token on the Workcell resolution table to the Übermensch line, which means that if we weren't already there, it doubles our future chances of success in our experiments. Okay, but if it turns out that reality is subjective, then instead we destroy a section of the ship, a blueprint of our choice, hoping we have a shield available, and turn it into 1 point of fuel. Right? And so as soon as we succeed in this experiment, we actually flip all the nuggets that are face down and not in the Cosmos. So that includes the nuggets accumulated on the front of the ship and the nuggets on the player's mats. By the way, they all stay where they are, but I insist, because there's no choice, you have to flip them all. And the result to be used, circle or cross, is the majority result, taking into account all the face-up nuggets, the one you've just flipped, as well as those you've flipped in previous turns. Finally, the successful completion of a Foolhardy experiment earns the chief engineer a medallion, the Mad Scientist Medallion, and it's a medallion that goes to the last player to have succeeded, so he can switch from one player to another during the game. And that's it. And you can see already a fundamental difference between standard and Foolhardy Workcells. The difference is that a standard Workcell is usually moved to a player's mat with the research action, then cyborgs and avatars work on it each time they want to trigger its effect, every turn if they like. For Foolhardy Workcells, it cannot be like that because, in a way, you are consuming a nugget every time. Let's say you've taken one nugget out of the cosmos, probably your ship flew through a particles cloud and there's a nugget stuck in front of it. Okay, so you can research and work on a Foolhardy experiment. You flip the nugget, which remains after that where it belongs in the space in front of the ship, and let's assume the result is a circle. This determines the result of the card to be used, and your nugget remains face up until the end of the game. And note that at this point, you can no longer research for a new Foolhardy Workcell or even work on one, because the prerequisite is a face-down nugget. And now that you've revealed the only nugget in play, you no longer meet this type of prerequisite. Later, you fly through another cloud of particles. You pick up another nugget face down. And so, you can once again research and work on Foolhardy experiments. Hop, you flip the new nugget. In this example, we still have a majority of circles. We apply the result that corresponds to a circle. And then ditto, we are stuck until we discover a new nugget. The last nugget, the last opportunity for a Foolhardy experiment. And there's no need to research a new one. A player can reassign an avatar or cyborg to the first Foolhardy experiment he kept on his mat. More than that, he is sure of the result because he knows he will have a majority of circles and he can earn 1 unit of fuel. That's it. And now no more Foolhardy experiments are possible until the end of the game, because there are no face-down nuggets anymore and the Foolhardy prerequisite can no longer be met. So, if you play your cards right, you'll be able to perform 3 Foolhardy experiments throughout the game, like we've just done. But note that sometimes the ship will fly through 2 particles clouds at once, for example, and collect 2 face-down nuggets. And then, if the crew works on a Foolhardy experiment, they'll have no choice but to flip the 2 nuggets at once. And so, in this configuration, at best, there can only be 2 Foolhardy experiments during the entire journey. So, with 3 nuggets in play, there are only 7 different combinations. And you can notice that they all give a clear majority, except one combination, this one, which doesn't give a majority. So, what do we do then? Well, first of all, in this case, the effect of the card is not applied. The experiment is useless. It fails. And the chief engineer of the experiment, the player who passed the die roll, becomes a posthuman. We'll see what that means later, but to sum up, it changes everything for the future of mankind. And so, if the leap in the unknown of posthumanity doesn't tempt you, you should avoid carrying out a Foolhardy experiment when there are only 2 nuggets out of the cosmos. Now I'm done, and I should recap one last time because this topic of nuggets and Foolhardy experiments is both complicated and very important for your mission. Collecting nuggets is important, and first because it earns you victory points, but only those nuggets that have been retrieved and end the game on a player's mat. I remind you that to recover a nugget stuck in front of the ship, you need to use the prospecting maintenance action found on the blueprint Wardens. But only face-up nuggets are essential if you're looking for a high level of cooperative victory. Because your real goal is not to collect nuggets, but to make them tell you what reality is. And that requires foolhardy experiments in order to flip your nuggets. And note that in this case, what counts is what we've learned about the reality of universe, and it doesn't matter whether someone owns the nuggets or whether they are still floating around in the front of the ship. And there you have it. I leave you with this beautiful screen to ponder, and I'll see you in the next video.